might formally welcome to Western Sydney Unfiltered, Dan Labbad, currently with the exalted title of Head of the Crown Estate. We might get Dan to explain that exalted body to us soon, but as I understand it, he pretty much is in charge of the UK foreshore as a joint venture between the monarchy and the UK government. It's a fair property gig. We know him mostly as the former boss of Lendlease International, various roles in Lendlease career, but up to and including his last role heading up particularly Lendlease in the UK, and a host of ours last year when the Westies came to town for the tour of East London, looking at the sort of amazing work that it had. Dan, importantly, is also the recipient of the inaugural and only International Leadership Award for the Dialogue as a young lad from Fairfield who kicked on. We're delighted to welcome you today, Dan. Welcome back to the Dialogue.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Lovely to be here.
Mate, it's early in the morning there. Thanks for your time. We've all been through in the last couple of days the high farce of a president with COVID. But remember this series, well, tragically, when we interviewed the head of the Royal London Hospital, who we'd also met with last year in September, about and been reminded that even notwithstanding the recent Victorian outbreak, our tragic death toll for Australia is less than single boroughs of the city within London metro area. Just from a COVID perspective, how's it dominating everyday business, political dialogue in the UK?
Oh, look, it's always there. It's top of the list. I think going through the summer here in the UK, things were looking hopeful, and I think people, whilst they understood the risks that there might be, a second wave, I think were leaning towards a hope that things would progressively work towards a normal. And a couple of weeks ago that changed with new restrictions coming in, and obviously the infection rate going up quite drastically. So it's omnipresent. It's that sort of cloud that's there every day, affecting everybody. I think the first few months people did really well just navigating it. I think now we're at the beginning of a new period of having to just again resolve that we're going to be going through this for some time, and it could be for some time. And so taking it a day at a time. So we're giving a lot of support to people over here where we can, and just helping people put things in perspective, helping with mental health issues and other well-being issues. And that's all you can do right now. But to answer your question, mate, it's every day. It's that cloud that's there, omnipresent.
From your time most recently, having been intimately involved in the development of East London, and the parallels we see for our region of Western Sydney and urban renewal, have you noticed, and you might notice it now, have you noticed sort of a drop-off in momentum, or is East London, like Western Sydney, being seen as a bit of a beacon of hope for local and federal governments, that development momentum, way to soak up unemployment and drive growth?
Yeah, well, right now, we're going through a period where unemployment is increasing, as you would expect. And, it's no doubt going to get worse before it gets better. So that's, where things are today. But I think, this country has, like Australia, a huge amount of resilience. And you find that in the toughest of times, that's when, people galvanise, and that's what's happening. I think that, East London, interestingly, with people working from home a lot more, the boroughs that predominantly residential are thriving, and it's actually the central city locations that are struggling, that don't have that residential component. So central London at the moment, we had 50 million people walking down Regent Street up until 7 months ago. And that was the case for as long as we can remember. It's no longer the case at the moment. So, and East London specifically, I've got no doubt when things ease, that resilience will result in a rebound. There's a lot of development on the cards, a lot of economic development on the cards, and I think that is still obviously working through. But when we see a rebound come through, when we see a recovery come through, I think we're going to see a rebound in activity, even though that might not sort of manifest in an economic rebound as quickly as we would hope. But I think activity will build quite quickly when things start to recover.
Maybe give people in Sydney now a bit of background to the Crown Estate. I said it sounds like a fancy gig. The joke always is, you could be the first sedan of Fairfield. It comes with royal patronage, and And I promised staff I wouldn't ask any questions about Megan and Harry or about Boris and your respective chairs and clients. But the Crown Estate's a unique one. I don't think Australia has an equivalent. So maybe just give us a background of the lofty heights that this lad from Fairfield's now in charge of.
So the Crown Estate is a £14 billion portfolio. It includes in its portfolio, as you said, a large proportion of the foreshore around this country, the seabed, which includes us facilitating or playing a key role in facilitating the very successful offshore wind industry here, which it's on its way to achieve 40 gigawatts of generation over the next 10 to 15 years, which is again a fantastic world story. We also own a large part of central London, Regent Street, most of St James, and a number of other areas, and we have about 17.
You and the Duchy of Gloucester. You got to divvy up. You and the Duchy of Gloucester divvy up the flash parts of the Monopoly board.
No, this is just.
Have you got the red squares, the yellow squares, the blue? Which parts?
No, I mean where the Crown Estate came into being was when the royal family passed on those land assets and those rights to the government over 200 years ago. And so the way that it works is that it's held in Crown. And so the monarch hold it in Crown as monarch, not personally, and the revenue goes to the government. So one of the great things for me is we are a commercial business. We do and have a remit to make money like everybody else, but 100% of our proceeds go back to the Treasury, so go back to the UK taxpayer. And so what you find when you talk to people who work for the Crown Estate is this huge pride where they can come to work and be as commercial as the next private sector company, but the profit we make goes back to taxpayers, which is something that people are very, very proud of.
I know one of your personal passions is sustainability. The idea of particularly wind power, which is one of the things that's stricken you. Are you comfortable with the debate in the UK about sustainability? We're having our own challenges in Australia with energy debate and trying to get an energy coherent dialogue about energy amongst the politics. In a region like Western Sydney, as you know, it can be 10 degrees hotter in Penrith than in Paddington on any summer's day. Are you comfortable that there's a path we can follow in the UK in similar political situation to have a more coherent, unified debate about renewable energy and sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important debate, and I think the climate emergency is after COVID the issue of our times. And let's be straight here. Yes, there's an environmental impact to the climate emergency, but equally there's a social impact to the climate emergency. So the relationship between the climate emergency and social equality is front and centre as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. And I think in the UK, there's a pathway to net zero by 2050 that's been endorsed by the government. It's something that you see industry and government here focused on. Thus, the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday around their continued commitment to offshore wind. As I said earlier, it's a growing industry and it's going to be a key part of our renewable energy mix in this country. And I think what's important in a political context is to have the hard discussions around what's required in order to avert the emergency, what type of world we're going to be living in, because the world is heating up. So therefore, what is that going to be? How do we adapt? And what are the transition arrangements? How do we work from where we are now to where we need to get to? No doubt some of that will be painful, but equally, I see a lot of economic development coming through that transition. And I think countries that focus on what they can create in terms of entrepreneurialism, commercialism and industry in order to seed the renewable sector, to seed the green energy sector, those are going to come out as economic leaders of the future.
So the third great resource of the North Sea, it was cod, it was oil, and now it's wind. A strong wind blowing up the north. You mentioned about the existential threats of our time. You have to realise that this this month in Sydney, it's all about whether the Panthers or the Eels win the footy this year, because we've got two Westies charging towards the finals. Well, one's charging and my team's limping, but we give it hope. Dan, looking at, we spoke about and we saw in fine form when we were in East London last year, the impact that Aussies have had in that part of the world. People like Sir David Higgins at English Partnerships and the Olympics and HS2 and everything David's been involved with, Fast Rail, with yourself at Lend-Lease, with John Burton and the Westfield team there, and even now an adopted Aussie in Tim Williams with the Thames Link, the great doctor. Why do you think it was that Australians were so prominent in that redevelopment, particularly in East London and London generally?
It's a really good question. I think one hypothesis is when I came over 15 years ago, and I know people like John, for example, and Tim Williams was already immersed. In fact, I met Tim and worked with him all those years ago, and you're very lucky to have him in Australia, I have to say. East London wasn't something that was seen as the greatest part of London from a philosophical perspective if you grew in London, and I think the work that Australian companies won, obviously Westfield and Lend-Lease with the Olympics, and a number of others have done very, very well. Multiplex obviously back then and to this day, obviously under different ownership. And I think
Wembley Stadium didn't help them, but it was I think they recovered that Maltese brand and had a tough run there for a while.
Still doing all right today. And I think that we have a pioneering, go-getting attitude, I guess. And I think that the other thing as well is when you grow up in Australian property, because of the size of our market in Australia versus say the UK, you have to learn to be a bit of a jack of all trades. You have to learn different parts of the property sector, vertically and horizontally, residential, commercial, retail, building, developing. There's no class hierarchy. I was trained as a builder, civil engineer and a builder, which I'm incredibly proud of. And then to become a developer and investor, there were no barriers, no class barriers. You mix with the same people. And I think coming over here, we were able to therefore break down some barriers unbeknown to us at the time. I think that's one of the reasons. That said, the Brits are also incredibly entrepreneurial and clever, and I think we work wonderfully in partnership. And
it was the Get Square for all those POMs and Irishmen coming to building sites in Sydney. We sent some bosses, they sent us workers, and it's an exchange program.
Mate, this is an important point because we sort of, I also love sort of taking the mickey out of different people for fun's sake. But one of the things for me growing up in Western Sydney and having, my father's from Egypt, he came out when he was 20. My mum's from Italy. She came out when she was younger, I think 5. But we had a European, Italian, Arabic, Anglo setting at home, my brothers and I. My parents had all sorts of friends, which was wonderful. And we really learned, I think, the lesson of seeing the beauty in difference, and I think one of the things for me that I love about working with different cultures is, ultimately people want the same thing. They want to be trusted. They want to be loved. And if you can harness that power, you can do a lot more than if you put up the barriers and see difference as ugliness, which unfortunately is programmed to survival instinct. And so I think, in my role internationally within Lend-Lease, in my role today in London, and certainly the thing I say to young people who always ask me, well, how do you become a chief executive of this or that? I say the number one thing is if you have to deal with people, learn to transcend difference, learn to see the beauty in difference. And that's what Western Sydney is. That's what Western Sydney.
You opened the door to Western Sydney, so let's go there. Kicked off life in Fairfield, a misspent youth at the Smithfield RSL and the Brown Jug and some of the local establishments running rampant before you finally decide to settle down and head off to then the University of Western Sydney, which you claim is great credit because it kicked you. We went from there quickly to UTS, which back in the day was an all too common thing about people at WSU. These days they stick, but in the early days it was a transition to a better uni. It was the hard reality we faced. So you had that background onto UTS, and then an MBA from UNSW. So you pretty much made your way through. Sydney's really got the shits. You've been everywhere but Sydney Uni in your academic career in Sydney. But what did you learn as you know, go back before you were a fancy pants graduate, but you're running around the streets of Fairfield, which, as we all know, in my day was where you learned to ride a horse. It was market gardens. It's now one big housing estate, essentially. What was it that you think shapes you for the gig you're in now? Without being too romantic about it, was there particular things that you picking up the diversity of people or the transcendent nature you spoke about? Does that come from a childhood locally?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. I think, well, firstly, I think it's an overstatement to say that I decided to go to Western Sydney. I think I had no choice because
another phenomenon back in those days. Yeah,
I owe a huge amount of gratitude to the University of Western Sydney because you know, there was an entrance exam that sort of sat outside. I can't remember exactly, but it sat outside the HSC. I didn't get the marks to get into engineering at UTS initially, but there were I think you could do from memory your first year at the University of Western Sydney. And if you graduated with a credit average, and you know, I grew up in Fairfield. I was knocking about, you know, with the boys and girls, and basically loved my soccer, which I know now is football, which I know that's a controversial subject.
You just noticed the Wanderers here now, so it's all.
Yeah, well,
and the MacArthur Bulls. There's the second one in Campbelltown too. So.
Yeah, well, no, I'm a huge fan of the Wanderers, obviously, and you gave me that jersey, which I'm incredibly grateful for. So, you know, the thing was that, you know, my upbringing, which I've talked about in terms of the setting, you know, the having the opportunity to go to university when perhaps I shouldn't have had that opportunity. And then, you know, people often ask me, you know, where do I get, you know, who are my role models? You know, I've got various, you know, family role models, but just to give you one example, you know, my Italian grandfather came to Australia in 1950. He wasn't well educated, but he was one of the wisest men I've ever met. And, you know, I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of people in my travels. And you know, the values that my family gave me and the settings in Western Sydney, earning the respect of your elders. And, you know, and I remember the way I came to discover Lend-Lease was some of my female friends growing up, their fathers were tradesmen, or they had building companies. And I said, oh, I'm doing civil engineering. Who should I work for, you know, when I graduate? And all of them said it was, you know, civil and civic, which was the precursor to what is now a global single name Lend-Lease, and the building company with Lend-Lease. And I thought, you know, fantastic. And they all said it and applied, and I still have the rejection letters, you know, and I went and worked for a wonderful company called John Holland, working on the on prospect water filtration plant, again in Western Sydney. And again, I just think that my working class upbringing and the opportunity to really, and you know, this sort of, when I get into sort of times of despair and challenge, where you know, it's like, oh, could I be bothered getting out of bed? I think about the sacrifices that my family made, and I think about other people around me that have heart. I just go, how dare I stop? How dare I not keep going? And so, you know, there's a whole host of things and a whole host of people that I've met, people giving me chances at times and backing me. You know, one of the things that I really enjoy doing is backing young people and giving them the chance, because if it wasn't for people backing me over the years, I wouldn't have had the chance. Stuart Hornery is another huge influence, you know.
You're a bit young for Dick Dusseldorp's time at Lend-Lease. What a legend to kick the company off, you know. Built Bradbury's for PPP in Campbelltown, MacArthur Station, Rich Tapestry, and now both Lend-Lease and Holland's building most of the big infrastructure, the base of the city. So
one of the things I notice, and
they survived you.
Yeah, no, they do, and they will. I think one of the biggest lessons, Chris, for me is, I guess, a theme in some of the men and women that I've worked with who have been role models has been this two things, I think. One, never be scared to ask dumb questions. And I still ask dumb questions, and I don't care. Like, it just, you know, and because especially in this world, you're just never going to have all the answers. And secondly, sometimes the answers to those questions come from, from young people and from people that look at things afresh. And I think this notion of, age is wisdom. Age might be an element of wisdom, but I think, in this day and age, you need to be open to different things. And one of the consistent things with all those role models who did well, another one is Sir Frank Lample, who was the chairman of Bovis, a big British and then international construction company. Young at heart, don't be scared to ask the dumb questions and listen to everybody, because someone's point of view might actually be the little gem, and it could come from anywhere.
So in a Western Sydney, East London model, you spent plenty of time there. You were a large part of the development, and we've often spoken about the models, the different models we saw, the Canary Wharf, the lessons we took from there, that there's a bigotry of local investors that foreign investors don't have, that we're probably seeing at the Aerotropolis here, where it's largely international companies trying their hand signing up the Aerotropolis, whereas the locals have been a bit slower to come on. We saw the model of Olympic Park London, where a great public-private partnership has delivered an amazing, innovative, but well-governed space, whereas historically Sydney Olympic Park was too public sector and didn't have the innovation. Canary Wharf, too private sector, probably didn't have the social benefit initially that came from it. So looking at your model, your experience in development and growing up in Western Sydney, your experience in developing and living in East London, and yes, he lives deep in East London. We've been to his favourite restaurant, and if you don't get mugged on the way to the thing, you're doing well. He's living the gritty East London life. What should we be wary of? In a post-COVID world, we get back to business as usual, and we get back on the development thing we're running with. What should we be wary of based on your experience of viewing and working in East London?
I think you can't overstate the importance of place. And what I mean by that is, I think some of your guests previously have made this point, but I couldn't agree with it more. And that is that you've got to govern place, not govern silos, because there is a relationship between architecture and health. There is a relationship between urban design and education. There is a relationship between those things and the quality of life for people. And if you sort of start by, I'm a big believer in giving everybody an equal chance to realise their potential. The role that placemaking makes in that is fundamental. And so I think that is important. I think partnerships between the third sector, the private sector, and government are essential. And one of the reasons why I took on the opportunity at the Crown Estate was because I was going to learn things that I've not learnt before, how you navigate, quasi-government private sector dynamics. And what I'm learning is that the language is different, and often things get lost in translation. Coming back to my point earlier about learning to transcend difference, and often the reason why public and private sector partnerships break down is because of a lack of alignment, but also a lack of understanding. There's a language difference. Those partnerships, though, are so important, so important. I think long-term visioning and making sure that you've got milestones that keep you honest along the way, and also being willing to course correct if your vision has to shift. And in the world we live in today, which, hard to tell what it's going to look like in 5 years sitting here right now, it's important that you develop mechanisms to course correct. And also making sure you're drawing on diversity. I think to create places that don't reflect the broader community, I think also, I think it goes to make some of those things like health, education, other things harder. And secondly, I think it causes all sorts of social issues that we don't have time to talk about today. So I think those things.
Let me finish with one of those for you then. We talk about being a kid from Fairfield, and ironically, our executive director, Adam Leto, is another boy from Fairfield who grew up in Westfield Sports High with Harry Kuehl, and reckons he's the second best footy player to come out of there. But we look at Fairfield these days, it is beset with some of the worst social problems in Sydney. It has the highest poker machine concentration in the country by far. It took about 80% of all the new Syrian refugees that came into the country. It doesn't have that one vibrant city centre as a Cabramatta or Fairfield or Smithfield, but it doesn't have a Penrith, Liverpool, Parramatta in the middle of it. What would your idea be if suddenly the Prime Minister or Premier says, Dan, when you finish that with the one special job for you, help us bring Fairfield back in, bring it along on the journey. Where do you think that sort of thing goes? If you think back to your time, what are the ways where you engage probably the most diverse community in Australia, but in somewhat many ways amongst the most disadvantaged as well?
Yeah, look, this stuff is hard, right? And if it were, if it was easy, I mean, we've got the same, levelling up agenda here across the country because of, the disparity here. And, you look at the most developed countries in the world have their Fairfields. And I think that, what is one of the things that often we get sort of lost on in property is that property and placemaking as a craft in its own right can change the socio-economic destiny of places on their own. And I'm not a subscriber to that, because in a lot of ways, property is a lag industry economically after other economic development. And so I think, what I'm saying in a roundabout way is, it's not just about placemaking in Fairfield. It's what is the vision for Sydney? What is Australia's industrial strategy, New South Wales industrial strategy? And how can you draw linkages between, those policies, the opportunity that comes from those policies, and what you're trying to achieve. And coming back to a point I made earlier, how do you bring all of government together to help solve that? Because, you're not going to solve health issues over the long term if you don't solve vocational education and training. You're not going to solve some of those things if you don't solve, inherent systemic inequality that exists across these issues. And so you've got to take a holistic approach, link it to policy. Coming back to a point I made earlier, there's got to be a vision and a purpose that everyone subscribes to. And then property and placemaking needs to play its part as a physical science, but it can't be the lead science. It has to follow a much broader agenda.
Well, I think you just made the case for, well, I'll be your campaign manager. We'll make you the mayor of Fairfield when you come back. That's after you take up a role as a patron of the dialogue. And I know Barney Glover has his eyes on you for, to make up for leaving WSU early. He's going to put you back to work for the university. But Dan, thanks for your time today. Thanks for not forgetting us and still caring and thinking about the role Western Sydney can play. We're a long way from the British foreshore, but there's still beats. We still hold a candle for you when you come back, my friend. So good luck and Godspeed.
Thank you, Chris, and hello to everyone in Western Sydney. So I owe it a lot. So thank you very much.
Cheers.